Welcome to the 33rd meeting of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development.
108 sub 2 and the motion adopted on Tuesday, March 23rd, 2021. We will now proceed to a briefing on the current situation of Alexei Navalny. With us today is Mr. Navalny's Chief of Staff, Mr. Leonidu Volkov. Mr. Volkov, thank you for being with us today. You will have the opportunity to deliver a brief opening statement of 5 to 7 minutes in order to brief the committee on the ongoing situation of Mr. Navalny. After that, we will proceed to questions from the members of parliament. As always, I would encourage all participants to mute their microphones when they're not speaking. And when you have 30 seconds left in your questioning time or in your testimony time, I will signal you with this yellow piece of paper. Interpretation services are available through the globe icon on the bottom of your screens, as always. And Mr. Volkov, I now invite you to take the floor. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much, dear members of the committee, for hosting me. It's a great honor. And, well, I try to keep my opening remarks very short because the most interesting and important part always is Q&A, of course. So just the basic facts are that, well, Mr. Navalny is now imprisoned for 108 days. He is now recovering from his hunger strike that he has held for 24 days in order to get medical examination by the civil doctors that he could trust after he developed numbness in his legs and in his arm during his unlawful imprisonment. Despite the multiple requests from the and the verdict of the European Court of Human Rights for his immediate release, European Court of Human Rights being an integral part of Russian legal system, Russian government refuses to release him, and so then he is staying in prison. Our abilities to be in touch with him are very limited. He's allowed to have visits by his lawyers Monday to Friday and working days. No letters are allowed, but they're still able at least to communicate verbally, so we are able to stay in touch with him through his lawyers. In the meanwhile, Kremlin develops like a new campaign, a crackdown against Navalny's political organization. We don't have a formal party. We filed papers to register a party 9 times through the last 8 years. All these attempts to register a party have been rejected. So we never were allowed to participate in any election as a political entity. Still, we have a vibrant and strong political organization. We used to have 40 regional offices in all major Russian cities. Our candidates managed to participate in local elections as independents, so not being endorsed by any party, and managed to win in local elections many times. Our movement runs completely on crowdfunding, so we were able to crowdfund. For our anti-corruption investigation and for our regional offices and for our electoral campaigns. Inside Russia, we have several millions of supporters who are engaged in, following our investigations on social media, donating us, participating as campaign volunteers in our campaigns. So now, the prosecutor of Moscow has recently requested to designate our political movement as extremist, which might sound fun for a very peaceful movement that only tries to get to participate in an election, but it's not that fun because it means that after the court will rule and decide that we are an extremist movement, this will happen on May 17th, so in 1 week from now, the leaders of the movement will be could face up to 10 years in prison. The donors, even if they send like 100 rubles, like $2 of a donation, up to 8 years in prison, and the members up to 6 years in prison. So we had to formally dissolve the movement, and as of now, it is formally not anymore existing. Having said that, we stay quite optimistic. We consider these all moves by Kremlin their electoral campaign, the preparation for the upcoming election. Russia will elect the State Duma, the national parliament, in 4 months, mid-September. This will be a very important parliament. It will be sitting during the transition of 2024, when Mr. Putin will have to either to get re-elected or to appoint someone else, but still he will face some significant challenges with the upcoming transition. So it's very important for him that this Duma be like very clean, very sterile, and while the approval ratings for his party, United Russia, are now like about 27%, Kremlin apparently admits that it's not possible to achieve the electoral result they wish, the constitutional majority in the Duma, without applying like extraordinary measures. That's why not only Alexei Navalny is in prison, but also very many of important opposition figures are either under house arrest or forced to leave the country. That's why our regional offices are now, they're trying to force us to close our regional offices to prevent any independent politician from campaign. So Putin has learned this lesson in the past. He knows very good that it's a bad strategy to stuff ballots and to rig the election on the day of polling. It's smart to steal the election from advance, just not letting anyone to participate, not letting anyone like independent, competitive to be in the ballot. And that's exactly what the Kremlin is actually doing now. Still, we have our strategy, which is called smart voting, which is the tactical voting, as in the UK, for instance. We endorse our support. We endorse like the relatively strongest candidates in every district. We ask our supporters to vote tactically for those who have best chances to defeat, to unseat the incumbent United Russia candidates. And we hope that we will be able to achieve a lot in this September, also based on our experience with 2 previous regional elections where we managed to defeat many of the United Russia members in regional elections. This will contribute to more like political turbulence and more competition in Russian internal politics, and hope this will help us to push things a little bit towards democratic change and transition. The final goal of our political movement is democratic change and transit. We believe that Russia is basically a European country by its history, by its culture. It belongs to Europe. So, and European means for us having working institutions, competitive elections, fair courts, independent media, and so on. Everything that Putin has destroyed and demolished in the last 20 years, and everything that citizens actually need to define how the country should develop, where it should go. So now we are often being asked, like, what does it mean? I mean, you want Russia to become a European country, but what does it mean? Like, I mean, Portugal and Denmark, Sweden and Greece are so different, but they have a greatest common divisor, which is they have the working democratic institutions, which citizens may use to decide where the country goes, like liberal to conservative, left to right, a little bit here, a little bit there. It's a very important thing that we have to realize, that Russian citizens do not have any of these tools in their possession now. And the basic thing now, the basic strategy is just to reinstate these basic political institutions, to relaunch political competitions, which is now close to non-existent in Russia. So that's where we are now, where we are going, and I'm very much waiting to your questions. Thank you so much for your attention.
Mr. Volkov, thank you very much. Just on a technical note, the interpretation tells us the sound is good in terms of quality. If you could just increase it a bit in your response to questions, and maybe the way to do that is just to speak a bit more directly into the mic rather than having it at an angle. I'll leave that for you to figure out, but if you could just bring the volume up a little, that would help us to interpret our four colleagues. We will now go into round one of our questions, and they consist of 6-minute segments each, and leading us off will be Mr. Diot. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you for being here, Mr. Volkov. I guess the one question that's on everybody's mind at the top is wondering how Mr. Navalny's health is, and is he getting proper medical attention?
So should I collect several questions, or I answer them one by one?
You'll have a 6-minute segment, Mr. Volkov, with Mr. Diot, and then we'll go to another 6-minute segment. I'll announce each segment, and he can ask you as many questions as she or he would like in that segment.
I see. So thank you very much, Mr. Diot. So his health is now better. He is in the hospital. It's a prison hospital, so not a very nice place to be, but at least there is some medical supervision, medical attention. So he is being given like the treatment. That was such a strange form of a public political compromise. So the requirement of his hunger strike was to get the doctors of his choice, the entrusted doctors, to examine him. Putin couldn't agree to that because, it would mean losing his face for Putin. But the international pressure and the domestic pressure was very strong, so they kind of compromised that he was examined by civil doctors in a civil hospital in Vladimir. They gave the results of the examination to Navalny's personal doctors. They checked, they agreed on something and disagreed on something else. So they agreed on the treatment, and now he's given that treatment that was like approved by his personal doctors. So
okay,
it's
that's great news.
That's
good. So overall, he's doing quite well.
Yeah, it's much better than it was. Well, he's recovering from the hunger strike. It takes time. So the hunger strike lasted for 24 days. You need pretty much the same time for a safe recovery after that.
That's good news. You touched on journalism a bit. I was a journalist for 30 years, so the state of journalism always interests me. Now, in our country, some independent media complain they're not often allowed at high-level government news conferences, or if they are, they won't be allowed to ask questions. So what's the state of independent journalism in Russia? And is it under threat, and what can be done about it?
It's quite close to non-existent. So Kremlin has a very efficient propaganda and disinformation machine. Kremlin has full control over television, media, and newspapers. The internet being the only relatively free resort where different opinions may exist and coexist. Kremlin is now actually launching a huge campaign against important independent internet media. The most recent news was that they designated Medusa, the largest independent news outlet based in Latvia, in Riga. They designated it to be a foreign agent, which is a very nasty designation because it prevents any advertiser from working with them. So it just influences the media financially in a very bad way. And of course, if they manage to kill Medusa, they will go after everyone else. So to support them, so Medusa is now trying, for instance, to launch a crowdfunding campaign. Hopefully, they will be kind of able to collect enough donations to keep going. So to kind of reimburse for the loss of the advertisement. But it's, of course, very hard time for independent media on one hand. On the other hand, we see a boom of investigative journalism in Russia, for instance, and actually people are really trying to find independent information. So more and more people turn away from the television because they realize now it's all propaganda, and people are actively looking for independent, decent opinion online. One last thing, very short. What's really important here is the positions that major internet platforms would take. Because technically, of course, Russian government has passed a bunch of laws that make also anti-Putin publication, any sort of anti-Putin publication on the internet illegal, of course. And they impose huge fines on Google, Facebook, Twitter, and so on for not deleting this information and so on. So far, Google, Facebook, Twitter are not caving to this attempts. They pay these fines, but they don't delete this information. If they manage to carry on, that would be okay. If they start to cave to these government requirements, this will have a devastating impact.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I've still got a minute or so. What actions do you think you would like to see the Canadian government take to doing in the release of Mr. Navalny? I know obviously we've had some sanctions. What else would be useful right now?
That's a tough question because Putin is taking this very personally. Putin apparently really feels like very personally offended by the fact that Mr. Navalny dared to survive the poisoning, dared to investigate his own poisoning, dared to return to Russia after being poisoned, and of course dared to launch this investigation about Putin's luxury palace on the North Sea shore, which kind of exposed all this way of thinking that, for Putin, like really money, like gold and red carpets is the most important thing in the world. This exposition was very dangerous for Putin, actually. But it also exposed that Putin really cares very much about money. So our short answer is to sanction his close friends, his oligarchs, the holders of his assets.
Thank you very much, Mr. Diot. We will now go on to Mr. Fonseca again for 6 minutes, please. Go ahead.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Volkov, for coming before our Committee of Foreign Affairs. Mr. Volkov, as soon as Mr. Navalny recovered from the poison attack, he decided to return to Russia. I have to say, amongst all of us, we found this to be a very courageous decision. Can you tell the committee about the factors that influenced Mr. Navalny's decision to return to his home country, where he was persecuted by the regime?
Thank you, Mr. Fonseca. We never had such a discussion. Even when Alexei was still in coma, for all of us, for me, for his wife, for his close friends and colleagues, it was never a subject of a concern. We all knew that once he recovers, he will go back. He did never consider like a continuation of his political career from exile. During his 10 years of active political career, he has faced very many repressions and risks. He was attacked with a chemical acid in 2017, narrowly losing an eye, and he had to undergo many surgeries after he was thrown his liquid in his eye. He was harassed by the government in many ways. He spent 1 year under house arrest. He spent a total of 8 or 9 months in jail, in detention, being arrested for 15 or 30 days after and then before each rally that he announced. He has built a large political movement, and he had a feeling that, now staying abroad, staying in exile would just, kind of nullify all of this. So it would denote that all the risks that he has taken already were for nothing. We all understand, it's very clear for us in Russia that you can't be an efficient political leader if you stay away. Many have tried this and no one succeeded. So I'm not a political leader, I'm a political manager. Well, I'm running the political organizations, the day-by-day operations of our bureaucracy, of our regional offices, and we decided jointly with Alexei 2 years ago, when the threat of my imprisonment became too large, that I have to leave the country and to get based in Lithuania in order to ensure the smooth operations of the organization. But for him, it was impossible, to call people to turn out for the rally if he is not participating. He's a politician, he is a citizen of Russia. He did nothing wrong. He did not violate any law.
Thank
Why
you.
should he stay abroad? But it's one very important thing that we never had a discussion on this. It was all clear for us from very beginning. He didn't have doubts. He didn't ask me, for instance, if he has to go or not.
Yes, he had an amazing conviction. But I have to say, Mr. Volkov, what you said is this is despicable. We see this as despicable. Mr. Navalny, being poisoned. This attack on him. It's not only an attack on him. It's attack on really human rights and democracy. Is what it is attack on. How likely do you believe that the Russian government to perpetrate further similar poison attacks against other opposition leaders, opponents in the near future? Like even for yourself, do you worry about, like, you go to a restaurant and do they know where you are in Lithuania, that you're being followed, that bad things are going to happen to you and to your family? Like it must be very difficult to just manage day to day.
Well, thanks COVID, I have not been to a restaurant for over a year now. But other than that, yes. So before August 2020, we have considered like the largest threat for an opposition politician in Russia, like normally, is to be arrested, to be put in prison. So if one decided to go abroad, one could have a feeling to avoid any possible risks. After August 2020, so after the poisoning of Mr. Navalny, we of course all realized that like no one is secure, that Putin is ready to deploy chemical weapons, not only against like former KGB agents whom he considers to be like traitors, like Sergei Skripal, but also against his political opponents. Before August 2020, we had such like a mental model that he distinguishes between like political opponents and the traitors. The traitors have to be killed, opponents have to be harassed, put to prison, and so on. But of course, I mean, who could think about things like poisoning, like Alexei Navalny? Now that it happened, of course, no one could feel safe. But I mean, frankly, what can one do to protect themselves against such a thing like a poisoning by a substance that is non-visible, non-palatable, not something? I mean, okay, we take some regular precautions. We try to like see what's going around. We have like cameras on the buildings where we live and work. But in general, that's just the level of risks that we have to face, unfortunately.
And we've seen the reports about how Russia gets involved in elections, be it in the United States or in other parts of the world. Do you think that they're like tapping into your communications, to your phones, anything that you're doing online? How does that affect your network, your family members? What is the fear factor there, the chill that everybody is experiencing?
And Mr. Volkov, just a brief answer, then we'll have to go to the next member. Thank you.
Yeah. Of course, they do a lot. So they run wide-scale, sophisticated cyber warfare information and also disinformation campaigns using cyber warfare. We are well aware of it. We are used to live in such a toxic environment. So like every of our employees gets a lot of phishing attacks, for instance, and everyone is trained how to respond to that attack. Their latest success was they managed to break in my mother's email. That was nasty, because I mean she was not so tech savvy and was not able to protect her. But our communications with the members of our staff and so on are quite secure.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fonseca. Monsieur Bergeron, je vous passe la parole, mais juste avant que je le fasse, j'aimerais...
Mr. Bergeron, I'd like to give you the floor, but just before that, I want to make sure that Mr. Volkov has access to information.
Have you selected... Okay, parfait. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Bergeron.
Thank you very much. Mr. Bergeron, you have the floor for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much, Mr. Volkov, for being with us today. We greatly appreciate the time you're taking to speak with us. I want to communicate all of our solidarity, and also I hope you can communicate this to Mr. Navalny. And actually, a few days ago, I was able to speak in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe in order to ask for the release of Alexei Navalny, and I was very proud to do this on behalf of my colleagues. And Canada, like other Western countries, like the US, like the European Union, carried out some actions in the sense of what you asked for, so imposing sanctions against certain oligarchs that are funding Vladimir Putin's activities. 9 Russian people were subject to sanction by Canada. Could you, you personally or your movement, could you maybe communicate to us other names of oligarchs who could possibly be the object of sanctions imposed by the government of Canada if the goal is to decrease the funds available to the beast that Vladimir Putin is? I think that we have to take some action, and we have to be able to identify clearly who these people are and why it would be good to do so.
And for your question, Mr. Bergeron, talking of personal sanctions, first of all, it's important that Europe, for instance, and also UK, US, and Canada took the first step, and yes, that they went from sectoral sanctions, from economical sanctions to personalized sanctions. Because unfortunately, every time a round of sectoral sanctions is launched, they of course open a lot of champagne there in Kremlin. They are just happy because, foreign sanctions against Russian economy, that is something that they could blame everything on these sanctions. Like, why does the household income of the average household in Russia decrease for 8 years in a row? Because of the evil West, because of NATO, because of US, because they are trying to kill our economy with sanctions. And so it just gives them an opportunity to steal more and explain everything using their propaganda machine with the sanctions. Contrary to that, personal sanctions, we believe, are efficient because, propaganda can't sell them as being sanctions against Russia. They are against concrete individuals, and these individuals are, of course, not our countries. They don't represent our country. So this is very important that, for instance, European Union adopted the European Magnitsky Law for human rights violations and started to sanction some individuals. Now, having said that, the first list of individuals was quite weak. These were mostly security forces officials who, yes, are in charge and are responsible for Mr. Navalny poisoning, but they don't travel abroad, they don't have assets abroad. The idea about personal sanctions against Putin's friends and oligarchs is not to get Mr. Putin rid of the financial support. Unfortunately, he has access to enormous funds. Russia has exported oil and gas worth over $3 trillion over the 20 years of Putin rules, and he and his friends got hold of the majority of these funds. But the idea is to build leverage against Putin and his friends, because every time Europe or US try to build bridges, to compromise, to build a dialogue, unfortunately Putin, with his psychology, considers it to be just a sign of weakness. He considers his Western counterparts, unfortunately, to be hypocrites. It was said that his sources said that, quite reliable sources said, that his favorite TV series is House of Cards. He thinks that they are all, say the words they have to say, like about human rights, liberties, and so on, democracy. That's because they have to say it for their voters. But they don't really believe it. They don't really believe it. They need my oil and gas, thinks Putin. And they really need money. They will deal with me. They will work with me, whatever I do. There are no red lines, and I could do whatever I want. And every time President Macron or Austrian Chancellor Sebastian Kurz suppose that despite everything, despite all the human rights violations, we still have to compromise and so on, Putin thinks, I have won again. So they still need my oil and gas so much. So the personal sanctions against Putin's oligarchs are important to win leverage against him, to build a strong position, like having his assets, and these are, nominally these are assets of his friends, but of course it's his personal assets actually, like freezing them would allow Western leader to talk to Putin from a much stronger position than they talk now, because money really matters a lot for him. That's our idea. The appeasement politics, unfortunately, has failed.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Bergeron. Je suis désolé, c'est votre temps.
Monsieur le Président, sur un rappel au règlement.
Oui, OK.
I would like to make sure to ask Mr. Volkov, because the issue was related to personal sanctions and on the fact that we were expecting that he could provide us, maybe not now, but a list of oligarchs and the reasons for which they should be on that list, maybe to send it to our clerk, Mr. Chair. Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Bergeron.
We will go straight on. Yes, please,
sorry.
go ahead.
It also came to my mind that we have this list of 35 names that we actually also published in some media, but I'll be happy to share it also with your committee.
Okay. We will now go to Mr. Harris for the final segment in round one, again for 6 minutes. Mr. Harris, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Volkov, for joining us. I want to say, first of all, that on my own behalf, and I think I speak for the very, very vast majority of Canadians who are abhor what's happening to Mr. Navalny in Russia, and also other, of course, individuals who have been taken on by the state and in some cases murdered and poisoned. In Mr. Navalny's case, ongoing threats and imprisonment and attempted assassination. And we really have to say we admire the personal courage and strength of Mr. Navalny and people like yourself in taking on this very heavy challenge. And I'm sure that the decision that he made to go back to Russia and face the consequences of being sure that he's there to lead will inspire others to also continue to try to bring about the kind of change that is required inside the Russian Federation. So, having said that, Mr. Volkov, I do have we are speaking openly here in a public meeting about the issues, and you have means of communicating with people inside of Russia, sometimes unencumbered, sometimes found out. But you do have a means of getting your message across to people by the sounds of things. And this is, I suppose, as an aspect of how this information can take place, that I'm assuming you are aware of a report that Amnesty International, for example, which is a well-known and well-respected international organization that supports the people who are fighting against authoritarianism and dictatorship and human rights violations throughout the world. There was a report, Republic, suggesting that they had removed Mr. Navalny from their list of prisoners of conscience because of some reported statements that he had made in the past. Are you aware of that allegation, which seems to have been taken seriously for some particular time? And do you know anything about where that may have come from?
Thank you very much, Mr. Harris. This is a very important issue because it actually showcases the spread and the strength of Kremlin disinformation campaign against Alexei Navalny and how seriously they are taking Alexei Navalny and his movement. Actually, it was back in 2013 when Navalny ran for mayor of Moscow, when they started to plant articles with disinformation against him in the Western media. They kind of posted a an article, for instance, they paid for an article in the Jerusalem Post pretending he being an anti-Semite, which is like quite funny because he was a guest of honor on my chuppah, and a lot of different stuff like that. But this year's campaign was, of course, like the most noticeable. That included like attempts to undermine his credibility and credibility of our movement on many different international platforms, including like people impersonating me, conducting different national and international bodies like the Parliamentary Assembly of OSCE and others, and including also like disinformation. The case of Amnesty International was very remarkable because they succeeded in that case. They presented them with a number of falsely interpreted quotes or the statements that Alexei Navalny, like that he made in 2007 and later revoked and commented on them, but they managed kind of to push this case through some of the regional branches of Amnesty that has led them to their decision. Now, unfortunately, we are in touch with them. They are campaigning strongly, and we are very grateful to them. They are campaigning worldwide to protect him and to release him. And it is my information that they will also soon reconsider their decision about Alexei's status as a prisoner of conscience. They told me just yesterday they will issue a press release on May 12th after they have examined how Russian disinformation campaign managed to influence them and how actually they kind of how they were made like victims of this disinformation campaign. They will issue they will not only reinstate the status, but they will also issue like a detailed post-mortem. It will be, I hope, very interesting of what happened and how it happened.
Hopefully a condemnation of the action to create this whole thing in the first place. I'm wondering another thing now, in a sense of, we know what you're facing and we know the difficulties of operating in the actual election, official election sphere in Russia. So there is a question, I suppose, is where do you go from here in terms of the campaign to bring about change inside the Russian Federation? And I'm wondering how you capture the spirit of the people of inside Russia who are seeking, they don't like authoritarianism any more than anybody else does, but it's a kind of, after the failure of the Soviet Union, for example, this did not lead to a widespread increase in people's standard of living or their ability to operate within a non-authoritarian regime. We have Mr. Putin offering that still, and we wonder whether or not people can be expected to believe that things might change under a different regime. So I'm wondering, when your campaign, and I'm looking at something that's published in Radio Free Europe about the creation of a new political party in 2018, which may have been the last time a new party was created. This is the Russia of the Future Party, created in May 19. By your organization, talking about real changes, real reforms, generalizations, I would call them to some extent, but not creating, it seems to me, a vision for a new Russia, a new Russian Federation with the kind of prosperity that might come to elevate people's standard of living. And I'm wondering, do you have that kind of vision that attracts people? Because we see reports of opinion polls by Levada Center. I don't know whether you believe those polls or not, showing they don't seem to be totally pro-Putin, but they don't seem to be recognizing that your movement is as strong as us and we might want to see it, or you might want to see it.
Mr. Harris, I'm sorry, a minute and a half over your allotment. I'm wondering if we could ask Mr. Volkov just to park that question in his mind and return to it in your second follow-up opportunity in round two, which we have to go to now just to be able to get through the full second round. I will turn it over, with your indulgence, to Mr. Chung for the next 5 minutes, please. But let's park the question by Mr. Harris and circle back to it. Mr. Chung.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Volkov, thank you for taking the time to appear in front of us today. You'd mentioned that sanctions are effective in countering President Putin's actions, a view that I share. Alexei Navalny published a list of Kremlin oligarchs who are responsible for enabling and keeping President Putin in power. Some of those oligarchs hold significant assets in Canada. Recently, the former world chess champion and Russian opposition figure, Garry Kasparov, also urged Western governments to apply sanctions on those Russians responsible for the poisoning and arrest of your colleague, Alexei Navalny. While the Canadian government has sanctioned some Russian individuals, it has inexplicably omitted others. And to that end, I would like to ask you about whether the Canadian government should apply sanctions on 5 specific individuals. All 5 of these individuals have been sanctioned already by the United States, by the United Kingdom, and by the European Union. The first person I'm wondering whether or not you think should be sanctioned by the Canadian government is Yevgeny Prigozhin, who runs the Internet Research Agency and the Wagner Mercenary Group, and who's on the FBI Most Wanted list, and whose organization has targeted Canada and Canadian government officials with disinformation. What is your view on putting him on the sanctions list?
Oh, yes, of course. He's a very dangerous criminal, first of all.
Thank you. And so I've got 4 other people I wanted to ask you about. Dmitry Kovtun, who is a former KGB FSB agent and now a businessman in Russia.
Well, Kovtun is the guy who is responsible for killing of Alexander Litvinenko in London in 1924. He's a KGB agent. He doesn't travel abroad. He doesn't have assets. So this might have a symbolic. Sanctions will not unfortunately harm him, but still it's important.
The third person I'm wondering about is somebody who was identified by Royal Commission in the United Kingdom as being responsible for the poisoning of Alexander Litvinenko, who's also a former KGB agent and now a Russian parliamentarian, and his name is Andrei Lugovoy.
Yeah, Lugovoy and Kovtun together, so this is the same story.
Okay. And 2 other individuals who were sent to Salisbury, England, who poisoned Sergei Skripal with Novichok, Colonel Alexander Mishkin and Colonel Anatoly Chepiga.
Yeah, sure, of course. I mean, these are unfortunately, with exception for Prigozhin, the 4 last names you mentioned, they are just criminals, killers. I mean, the Russian security forces officers that committed lethal attacks in UK in 2004 and 2018. They have to be brought to court, but sanction will only have like a moral effect.
But Prigozhin certainly is somebody with significant interests internationally. What is so concerning about the lack of Canadian government sanctions about him is that the European Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States have placed sanctions on him, and we haven't. And so we've, in effect, given the Canadian government has given Mr. Prigozhin plenty of time to shift his assets outside of this country in anticipation of potential future sanctions, which is the reason why I believe it's so important that Western democracies work in concert at the same time to impose sanctions on oligarchs in order to ensure that they can't anticipate these sanctions and shift assets outside of our country.
I can't agree more.
Okay. Mr. Chair, I have no further questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tong. We'll go right ahead and go to the next set of questions, which will be asked by Ms. Sachs. Please go ahead, Ms. Sachs, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Volkovым, for joining us at Foreign Affairs Committee today. Your testimony is very important to the work that we do here and critical in making the important decisions that we have to make as a Canadian Parliament and government. So I want to start with, and I'll be sharing, Chair, I'll be sharing my time with Dr. Fry.
Thank you.
She's laughing. Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. if Dr. Fry wishes to share time, it's available to her. She can just give me a wave. Sorry, Mr. Volkov.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair. I would like Ms. Sachs to use the time fully. Splitting a small amount of time doesn't work really well. So you go ahead, Diara, and do your thing.
Okay, thank you.
Very good.
Fry.
Thank you. Thank you for the clarification.
All right. Okay, apologies, Mr. Volkov. So I'd like to start first and foremost. We discussed earlier about the move to label and disband democratic opposition extremists, and we've talked about the big picture risks for Mr. Navalny and family members and yourself in terms of the very aggressive and despicable acts in terms of poisoning that have been done by units from the FSB. But what are the risks to your followers and other democratic activists in Russia? So these are the people on the ground, day to day. You know, in terms of fostering a movement, it's not just the leadership that are at risk. I'm asking, are the people on the street at risk?
Yes, they are, and the risks are growing. So when we had protests in January this year, 12,000 people have been detained, which was effectively the largest wave of repression in our country since 1937, since Stalin times. About over 100,000 people, over 1,000 people have been arrested following this detention for like short terms, like 15 or 30 days, but it's still very important. Like people are losing jobs and being like fired, expelled from their institutions, from their colleges, and so on. So Putin has shown that he is ready to scale up the repressions, unfortunately, and yes, this puts our supporters at risk. So, for instance, like the new law and the designation of our organization as an extremist would entitle all our donors to up to 8 years imprisonment. So we will have to stop accepting any donations inside the country once this court decision is effective, because we have like 160,000 donors who sent us like the average of 500 rubles, so $7 a month, and we'll have to stop all of this because otherwise any of them would be at risk. Well, Putin doesn't have a repressive machine strong enough to arrest 160,000 people, but he would arrest like 10 random of them to scare all the others, just to scare all the others. So, and that's what he's doing. Like every large protest rally, he would arrest like maybe 1% of the participants, very random people, but then the other 99% also feel vulnerable, and so he increases the level of terror and distrust in the society. So we have to think a lot about protecting our supporters, and we try to do a lot to protect them.
I understand. And just going in that vein, you know, in these types of authoritarian and repressive efforts that we see from the Putin regime and denying of human rights, there's always a trade-off for leaders. They have to promise something in return. And you mentioned earlier that often Putin uses the example of, oh, yes, our economic situation is due to the sanctions from the West. But you know, there's also the flip side of it, of trying to use economic promise to buy power. But what we see in the reality on the ground in Russia right now is that the average life expectancy of a Russian male is about 66 years of age, 5 times lower than the European Union average. And in 2018, Putin, during the World Cup, did a change to pensions across Russia while siphoning billions for his own personal use. So, and we've seen reputations to that. But what I'd like to ask is, you know, in light of, is there a growing opposition in light of this reality for the, you know, where's the average Russian family and individual today in this mess?
This also relates very much to Mr. Harris' important questions that I didn't have time to reply to, so I'll try to combine it and keep it short. So Putin was very successful selling the idea of the 90s, like the 90s, the early 90s after the destruction of communism were really a disaster for many families. Many families were not ready to the enormous change in everything. I mean, in the Soviet times, people didn't know what is money. Yeah, the money is an institution. It didn't work in the same way in the Soviet economy as it works in the market economy, right? And so I'm not talking about, I don't know, like stock market or something like this. People didn't know what are banks, what is entrepreneurship, what is like doing business, what is profit, and so on. People were not prepared to it at all. So the early 90s were indeed, were the times of big political freedom, but economically it was a disaster. And Putin came to power and managed to gain a lot of popularity by saying, okay, this time will not repeat. So his main political idea was selling this notion of stability. I brought stability to you. This was his motto. Now, it worked all through like 2000 to 2010. People were ready to forgive him anything for the stability. But now,
Mr. Volkov, I apologize. Just in the interest of time, we'll have to move on. But you'll have an opportunity in the response to other colleagues to elaborate on what you're saying. My apologies. We just want to make sure we get through the second round of questions. Monsieur Bergeron, je vous passe la parole maintenant pour 2 minutes et demie, s'il vous plaît.
Merci.
Mr. Bergeron, you have the floor for 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe that everybody understands why you are waiting on the tribunal's decision in terms of legality of banning your movement. But while you're waiting, would it not be wise to create a new movement under another name, and then the Russian state will have to make a decision on that new movement?
Unfortunately, it doesn't work this way. It would be a smart idea, but if one creates, if a movement is recognized as extremist movement, and someone creates a new one, it is the expert of the investigative committee who will decide if this new one is a replica of old one or not. And if the expert of the investigative committee finds that the new movement is doing the same as the old one was doing, it will lead to exactly the same repercussions for its participants, unfortunately.
Donc, vous êtes vraiment...
So you're really stuck with waiting for the tribunal decision. And if that decision was not in your favor, what would you consider doing at that point?
So, I mean, we don't have any doubts about what the decision will be. So it's not, I mean, Russia doesn't have, unfortunately, an independent court. So on May 17th, it will happen. So we are getting ready to that. So we are moving more on our activities online. So internet still is a relatively free media. A lot of things that we were doing are actually enabled through the internet, like this tactical voting. We don't need offline infrastructure to do that. Our anti-corruption investigations, of course, we will keep moving on with them. Now we relocate some of our staff from Russia to Lithuania or to other countries to keep them safe. So we'll pretty much continue doing what we are doing now. So it's we face a lot of like organizational changes. We have to rearrange many processes, but we'll carry on.
Merci, Monsieur Bergeron. Je suis désolé.
Thank you, Mr. Bergeron. I'm sorry, that's all the time you have. So we have 3 other questions.
Minutes, then Mr. Diot and Mr. Oliphant. Mr. Harris, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. And I'm going to give Mr. Volkov an opportunity to continue his response, but I'd ask as well, in that you just touched on it, the use of the internet. Is that media free or easy for people inside of Russia to actually see what goes on and receive information that's available on the internet, or is that controlled as well?
So Putin is trying hard to put internet under control, but still it remains a relatively free media. because the Russian internet has developed itself in the 90s, which have been a time of political freedom and economic competition. So it developed itself in a very competitive way when every internet service provider tried to build its own transporter link. For instance, like China has 3 transporter link for its domestic internet providers, while Russia has over 900 of them. So like the Chinese internet was built by design as a very controllable one, while Russian internet was built as relatively free. And now, so far, Putin's efforts to put it under censorship are failing. They're not so successful. So back to your previous and very important question. Once again, so Putin was selling the stability and this concept of the poverty in the 90s, and he was bringing stability and so on. But now Russia goes through a generational change. So Putin is there for 22 years now. So a whole generation appeared of people who did not know anything but Putin, and they want change and they look for change. These people are also like native internet users, not native TV audience. The audience for Putin's TV propaganda decreases, while the audience of people who have internet access increases. Also, people traveled a lot. This is very contrary to what people experienced in the communist time. People were able to travel to Europe to see how democracy is working and how the society could live with the democracy and so on. So it's a slow change. You are right. Putin still enjoys quite a lot of support. The polling of Levada is quite correct. He's about 50%, but it's not anymore the 80% of approval rating he had 10 years ago. And as many people manage to get access to different opinions on the internet, people try to realize what's going on, and things like, for instance, our investigative video are of great help.
Thank you.
Here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harris. We will now go to Mr. Diot for 5 minutes, please.
Mr. Volkov, we were talking earlier about sanctioning people. How about an individual named Roman Abramovich?
He's number 1 on our list. So that we suggested also to the EU and to UK and to the US government. He is really probably, Putin has many asset holders, nominal holders of the assets that are actually Putin's own, but Mr. Abramovich definitely holds the thickest wallet.
Excellent. Just shifting to another topic. I've got a large Ukrainian-Canadian community in my riding here in Western Canada, and they and a lot of other Canadians are really concerned with the aggressive actions Putin's taken against Ukraine. What are Mr. Navalny's views on the status of Crimea and eastern Ukraine and the threat that Russia could take further action?
Alexei was asked many times about the Crimea annexation, and you could easily find many of his public statements on this. To wrap it up very shortly, we recognize that the annexation of Crimea was unlawful, that Putin has committed a crime against Russia and Russian national interests because he violated the international agreements which kind of caused sanctions to be applied against Russia, that undermined credibility of our country as an international in international cooperation and so on, after he publicly violated Russian obligations towards Crimea according to the Budapest Memorandum of 1994. So now, not always when a crime is committed and when a crime is recognized, it could easily be reimbursed. So when someone kills another person, we could punish the killer, but we unfortunately are not unable to revive the victim. So Putin has created a huge problem for the for the world, which probably will remain a huge problem like the Northern Cyprus or the West Bank or many other territories for the future. Because, I mean, now there is the fact that, well, 2 million Russian citizens suddenly are there in Crimea. Their opinion has to be taken into consideration. So we consider that maybe like the future government of Russia and future government of Ukraine with some international mediators will be able to build some process to deal with the status of Crimea. So it is an unlawful annexation, but now it looks like there is no simple way out of the situations that Putin created. With regard to the eastern Ukraine, it's very clear. So, I mean, Putin's Russia committed a crime against humanity, sponsoring the civil war that has taken lives of 13,000 people. It's a crime. Russia has to stop to support the paramilitaries there in the Donbas region, has to act with agreement according to the Minsk agreements that Russia has signed, so to give border control to Ukraine, to stop supporting those separatist movements in Donbass, and then the situation will get back to normal. That's quite clear for us.
Just a very quick question on, we talked about your movement and how it's being repressed. What's the general state of the protest movement in Russia, and what has been done to suppress it? I was just looking at a Reuters story, and it shows people basically painting over logos of Mr. Navalny, etc. What's happening?
Yeah, well, what's happening is that Putin is very effectively building the society that has been described by George Orwell in 1984, and the painting over the graffiti belongs there, and many other things also belongs there. He's really like acting by that book.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Diod. We'll now go to our final round of questions, our set of questions, and it'll go to Mr. Oliphant for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Volkov. First, I believe we have a friend in common, Daniel Rohr, and if you see him, I hope you will give him my best as a wonderful young Canadian filmmaker, and I hope that his story gets widespread world attention when he makes it. So, give him my best. I want to assure you, following Mr. Chong's questions, that you may or may not be aware that on March the 24th, our Minister of Foreign Affairs issued another round of sanctions in direct response to Mr. Navalny's arrest and detention. And we are constantly reviewing these. We have two different regimes for sanctions in Canada, and we make sure that they're both judicious and effective. So we won't be putting criminals on sanctions, despite people perhaps saying it. We look for very effective ways. We also do it in tandem with international partners such as the United States, the United Kingdom, European Union, etc. So this is in constant discussion. If there are suggestions you have for that, we're always happy to take them because we will review them. We have two pieces of legislation, however, that we have to follow, and we're very careful in how we do that. That list on March the 24th was done in concert with the Americans. I wanted to get out of sanctions for a moment, though, and talk about the effect of the prosecutor's move about the Anti-Corruption Foundation and how that will limit either your work in Russia or outside of Russia, and if you have any suggestions for Canada and how we could be supportive of what the prosecutors are labeling you as an extremist organization for the anti-corruption work you're doing.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Oliphant. So for sanctions, I think a lot of important things already have been said, and I understand how complicated this process is, how many legal complications it has. Just one little thing to add is that, of course, it's very important that the international community acts together Canada, United States, European Union, and UK. But let me suggest that the key part of the story is the UK here. So if you could kind of push and influence UK informally, it's the most essential, because 80% of those assets in question are being stashed in London. So now for this,
I will just mention the government is aware of that, and there are conversations.
Thank you. Now for the second, once again for this extremist organization status. This will have a lot of effect on our ability to conduct offline activities in Russia. Offline activities will become very dangerous for its participants, and we will have to limit them to an absolute minimum. So we'll have to relocate many of the employees, and we'll have to focus on the online. But we know what to do. I mean, we have a lot of things a lot of projects that we wanted to launch online, but we didn't have resources to do that because we were busy with some other things on the ground. So now we will have our hands free to do these projects that were somewhere in the backlog. So now we will be back to them, and hopefully Mr. Putin don't like the consequences of his decision to destroy our offline organization in the country. Still, it's the most important thing is how many people we are able to reach. So when we started our movement, we had maybe 50,000 followers. Then after Navalny's presidential campaign, when we built this regional network, we were able to reach to several million people. Now we have a daily audience of about 15 million supporters, and it's large. And we'll keep talking to this audience despite all the problems with also internet censorship and so on. And we'll keep growing it using also the generational change that is happening in Russian politics now, on which I already elaborated answering to Mr. Harris' question.
Thank you very much. I just want to thank you. I know it's late where you are, but also to say that I hope you have heard, even though we come at it differently, in Canada there's no difference of opinion among the parties on these issues of human rights and Mr. Navalny in Russia. We are very united on this, and we'll constantly find ways to support you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Oliphant.
Thank you very much, Mr. Oliphant. Dear colleagues, this brings us to the end of the officially allotted period, but I think that Mr. Bergeron would like to ask a question of the committee concerning a possible extension of the period of questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair. With Mr. Volkov's permission, I would ask for unanimous consent of my colleagues so that we could have a final round of 2 minutes per party.